Good afternoon. I'm Adam Lupel, IPI's Vice President, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to this policy forum on the role of women's organizations in combating gender-based violence in conflict-affected areas. I'd like to thank our partners for this event, the Kvinna Foundation and the Permanent Mission of Sweden to the United Nations. Kvinna has defended women's rights since 1993, working directly in areas affected by war and conflict to strengthen the influence and power of all women. We are sincerely grateful to hear from the delegation of women's rights activists from 3 conflict and post-conflict countries, Bosnia-Herzegovina, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Ukraine, who are taking part in this panel today. Amplifying the voices of civil society leaders and providing a bridge between their work and policymakers here in New York is a core part of IPI's mission to promote a more inclusive multilateralism for a peaceful and sustainable planet. As no doubt is well known in this room, I'm sure some of you are across the street, the Security Council is holding its annual open debate on women, peace, and security today. I hope they're on break for lunch so that we have everyone here. As part of the WPS agenda back in 2008, the Council adopted Resolution 1820, which recognized sexual violence as a tactic of war. 15 years later, we are still witnessing an increase in conflict-related sexual violence and other forms of gender-based violence in many conflict-affected countries and widespread impunity for perpetrators. Just yesterday, Deputy Special Representative of the Secretary General and UN Humanitarian Coordinator in Sudan, Clementine Nkweta Salame, reported that 4.2 million women and girls are currently at risk of gender-based violence in the country. IPI has been engaged on this topic for a number of years through our dedicated program on women, peace, and security, directed by my colleague Phoebe Donnelly, who's here. Most recently, through studies on the protection-based risks to women participation in Libya and Northern Ireland, a report on the use of forced marriage by non-state armed groups, and a training course for peace operations personnel on sexual and gender-based violence in international peace and security. This event looks to highlight the role of women's organizations in combating gender-based violence in conflict-affected countries, and to have this serve as a call to member states and the UN system to provide additional support to these organizations and their intrepid leaders who risk so much to do work of such vital importance. Before we turn to our panel, which will be moderated by my colleague, Dr. Phoebe Donnelly, Senior Fellow and Head of Women, Peace, and Security at IPI, we will have 2 further opening remarks. First, we will hear from Her Excellency Elizabeth Taylor Jay, Vice Minister for Multilateral Affairs for the Ministry of Foreign Relations of Colombia. Welcome to IPI. And then we will hear from His Excellency Ambassador Andreas van Uxkull, Deputy Permanent Representative of Sweden to the United Nations. Thank you, Minister. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Firstly, I want to thank the International Peace Institute and partners for the invitation to attend this event and to talk about the role of women organizations in combating gender-based violence in conflict-affected contexts. It is a great pleasure for me to share Colombia's experience in which women and feminist movements and organizations have been the main protagonists. Thanks to them, we have advanced in the Women, Peace and Security agenda with the formulation of our first National Action Plan on Resolution 1325 after more than 23 years, and there is no explanation for that, why the government didn't advance in this during the past 2 decades. Millions of women in Colombia's armed conflict saw their dignity, their bodies, and their territories pierced by the war. Indeed, the Truth Commission listened to the stories of 10,864 women in which they acknowledge not only what their experience, but also what cannot happen again. Colombian women understood that war is a manifestation of patriarchy and that it undermines their dignity. Thus, they decided to organize as political subjects and agents to foster change in our country. Women and feminists, through their organizations and movements, became essential for the reconstruction of the social fabric, the recovery of life, and the promotion of truth and forgiveness. These organizations have played a fundamental historical role in breaking the vicious circle of violence by declaring their forceful opposition to armed conflict, their peaceful resistance, their collective defense of life and dignity, and their struggle for human and feminist security. They are the ones who have taught us that security and nonviolence are not only about military power or non-aggression, but rather the satisfaction of basic needs, meaningful participation, the protection of rights, and as the Vice President, Francia Marquez, would say, until dignity becomes custom in our country. Colombia is the living proof that the joint work of organized women and feminists, even before the adoption of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda with Resolution 1325 of 2000 and Resolution 1820 of 2008, is crucial to keep the Women, Peace and Security Agenda alive and the prevention and elimination of gender-based violence as a weapon of war. The maximum embodiment of the importance of the role of women's and feminist organizations and movements is the definition and establishment of a specific strategic line to address gender-based violence in Colombia, First National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security. Based on a large participatory process that we began exactly 1 year ago, and in which we listened to more than 1,500 women in our country, it was collectively defined that one of the expected impacts of our plan is gender justice and the prevention of gender-based violence, with an emphasis on sexual violence in context of armed conflict. We know that in the implementation and localization of this plan, women's and feminist organizations and movement will continue to be protagonists and the main mobilizers of concrete actions, not only for appropriately addressing the violence, but as for its effective prevention. I would like to end with a phrase that personally strikes me. As women's victims and feminist organizations say, without women voices, the truth is not completed. Thank you so much.
Vice Minister, Vice President, colleagues, wonderful experts here at the podium. It's for me a great honor to let me opening up today's discussion on a topic organized by Kvinna till Kvinna and the IPI. The topic combines two of my government's priorities in our global strategy for gender equality. First, support for women's rights organizations. Secondly, an ambition to end all forms of gender-based violence. Conflict-related sexual violence as a tactic of war, torture, terror, and political repression has been one of history's most hidden crimes. Chronic underreporting due to fear of reprisals, trauma, and lack of adequate legal and investigative resources have rendered conflict-related sexual violence and is the world's least condemned crime of war. Perpetrators of sexual and gender-based violence must be held accountable. A widespread impunity sends a dangerous signal worldwide. As member states, we must loudly condemn these crimes and support every avenue of justice at national and international levels. We must also work towards dismantling the dangerous norms that sanction these crimes and uphold the crippling stigma for survivors. The fundamental role that women's rights organizations play in the work to achieve normative change through both political and financial means need to be recognized. Also, their concrete support to survivors in bringing these crimes into light. The Swedish Agency for Development Cooperation, SIDA, supports the work of women's rights organizations in combating sexual and gender-based violence. These include projects to counter gender-based sexual violence in the Democratic Republic of Congo and capacity building to develop legislation on gender-based violence in Iraq, Bosnia and Herzegovina. In Ukraine, Sweden made a specific contribution to UN Women's so-called safe space centers, assisting women and girls in Ukraine and Moldova who have been victims of conflict-related sexual violence. I am therefore very pleased to see so many experts from many of these countries that I just mentioned represented here today. And I'm truly looking forward to listening to your perspectives and your insights in the discussion that will follow. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Vice Minister. Welcome, everyone, to IPI. I'm Phoebe Donnelly. I lead our Women, Peace, and Security program. We really appreciate our in-person and online audience being here during a very busy day. We're really glad to have you here to talk about this important topic, the role of women's organizations in combating gender-based violence in conflict-affected contexts. I also want to thank our partners, the Permanent Mission of Sweden to the UN and Kvinna Foundation. And one of the really special things about Women, Peace, and Security Week is having delegations here who are coming from different regions to talk about the work they're doing on the ground. So we're really thrilled to have this delegation and really grateful to Kvinna. Today's event, I'll introduce each speaker briefly, but their full bios are in the list at the back. And I'll pose them an opening question. Then after each speaker has given some opening remarks, we'll open up to the in-person and online audience for questions for the panel. So please have your questions ready. It's my honor to turn to Jessica Poe-Janrell, who's an advocacy advisor at Kvinna, and note that the amazing report Jessica and her colleagues produced is at the back. And so she's going to tell us more about that. Jessica, can you tell us more about the findings from your report on gender-based violence and conflict and the role of women's rights organizations? Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having us. And it's really great to see so many people in the room today. So in this study that I hope many of you have seen the copies in the room, we've looked at gender-based violence in 4 different conflict-affected countries, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in DRC, in Iraq, and in Ukraine. And we have identified 6 themes that all these contexts have in common. And the first theme is the importance of women's rights organizations in conflict-affected countries. And in all 4 case studies, there are high levels of conflict-related sexual violence and other forms of gender-based violence that as a result of the conflicts. But states have been more or less unprepared, unable, and in some cases unwilling to provide victims and survivors with sufficient support and hold perpetrators to account. And due to this lack of government response and absence of legal frameworks, local women's rights organizations have played an essential role in offering protection and shelter, medical and psychosocial support, and legal aid for victims and survivors, as well as calling for accountability. They've also been instrumental in driving change, including legislative change, and in implementing new practices and dismantling harmful norms. And in spite of this, they remain severely underfunded in most contexts, and their expertise is rarely taken into consideration. And so our recommendations surrounding this first theme is very much focusing around increased funding for local women's rights organizations in conflict-affected countries, and also the importance of long-term, predictable, flexible funding for organizations to also be able to achieve sustainable change. And another focus of our recommendations in this first theme is insisting that all actors use survivor-centered approach in all interventions related to conflict-related sexual violence and other forms of gender-based violence. The second common theme that we have identified in this report is the importance of acknowledging other forms of gender-based violence in addition to the conflict-related sexual violence. So in the study, we've seen that when actors do pay attention to violence against women in conflict, it tends to be limited to the conflict-related sexual violence. And we want to highlight the importance of not only focusing on this, but also recognize the fact that domestic violence and intimate partner violence always increases and is exacerbated during and after conflict. For example, in Ukraine, the government has acted rather quickly to investigate cases of conflict-related sexual violence committed by Russian soldiers and worked closely with the international community on investigating war crimes, which is really great. However, many of the women's shelters that we work with in the country have also seen a big increase in domestic violence as a result of the war, and this must also be addressed. Another type of gender-based violence that we bring up in the report is sextortion, sexual extortion, which is both a form of corruption and a form of gender-based violence. And because of that, it falls in between the legislations of gender-based violence and corruption, and is almost always left unaddressed. And sextortion seems to thrive in conflict-affected countries. In DRC, for example, sextortion is so common in all parts of societies as become part of women's everyday lives. In the workplace, for example, women are subjected to sextortion in order to get a job, in order to keep their job, in order to collect their salaries. And we're hearing men who don't want their wives to take a job because it would mean sharing your wife with her boss. Recommendations around this thematic area is to really push for the legal framework of different forms of gender-based violence, including domestic violence, and to put domestic violence on the agenda in conflict-affected and post-conflict societies. And also, of course, to acknowledge and address the widespread problem of sextortion and promote its inclusion in both anti-corruption and GBV legislations. The third thematic common theme that we've seen in the report is the importance of paying more attention to stigmatization as an obstacle to access support and justice. And what we found in all 4 case studies is that stigma really hinders victims and survivors from speaking up, seeking help, and claiming justice, which leaves many victims and survivors without any support and justice. In Iraq, for example, sexual violence against women and girls is so heavily stigmatized due to the country's deeply rooted honor system, which is also embedded in the legal system. Women and girls who have been subjected to sexual violence are often condemned by their communities. And as you might know, there are also honor killings for women and girls who have been raped. This makes it essentially impossible for women and girls to speak up and report what they have been subjected to. And what this means is that although we have heard about the horrific crimes committed by ISIS against the Yazidi women in Iraq, due to the fact that their religious leadership accepted them back into their communities and made it possible for them to speak up, other women in Iraq, and perhaps especially Sunni Muslim women, have still not been able to speak up about the conflict-related sexual violence that they suffered under ISIS, and are thus still not able to access support and justice. And here in this thematic area, our recommendations are focusing on the importance of investing in long-term work to change norms, and also to work with religious and traditional leaders to reduce stigma. And of course, also to acknowledge victims and survivors of conflict-related sexual violence and children born out of sexual violence as civil victims of war who are entitled to reparations. Our 4th common theme is the importance of paying more attention to the reproductive pressure that women and girls experience during and after conflict. In several conflict-affected areas, women and girls are being pressured into bearing more children during and after war to make up for the demographic losses, either of an entire population or for a specific ethnic group. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, many women were under pressure to have more children to rebuild the nation. And now in some parts of Ukraine, we have seen a similar pressure on women. And the recommendations on this area is, of course, to make sure that population control policies in conflict-affected countries are not altered in any way that weaken sexual and reproductive health and rights. The fifth common theme of the report is the fact that working against gender-based violence puts women human rights defenders at risk. In conflict-affected countries, working against gender-based violence is often dangerous, and many human rights defenders are subjected to violence and threats of violence by both state and non-state actors. For example, in DRC, women journalists who reported on conflict-related sexual violence received death threats from armed groups, while governments threatened to have their media outlets shut down. In Iraq, women human rights defenders have had to go underground due to extreme security challenges, and women human rights activists have also been killed for their activism. This violence, which is sometimes deadly, is an effective way of silencing human rights defenders and a serious threat to democracy. Our recommendations around this theme is, of course, that the international community must pay more attention to this, condemn the attacks of women human rights defenders, and also help support women human rights defenders to make sure that they are secure. The last theme, common theme of the report, is the fact that the work against gender-based violence is also work for peace and security. And what we've seen is that in many conflict-affected countries, women rights activists often, as a result of working on gender-based violence, have become important actors for peace. In Bosnia, women's rights organizations working on gender-based violence cooperated across conflict lines during the war, which was very dangerous and very controversial. But this opened up spaces for dialogue between ethnic groups and have been extremely important for the peace-building work. In DRC, women's rights organizations work together to raise awareness on conflict-related sexual violence and submit a joint list of priorities ahead of Sun City Agreement and other peace talks, demanding the violence to be addressed in the agreements. So in many places, they have built trust across conflict divides and demanding inclusive peace. But despite this, as we know, women rights organizations are rarely invited to peace process and their priorities are often neglected. And the recommendations in this common theme is focused, of course, on insisting on women's participation in peace processes and always include adequate, well-informed provisions in peace agreement that focuses on women's needs, justice, as well as women's political and economic rights. So that was my very condensed presentation of this report. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. And as I mentioned, this detailed report is from the back, and there's many more rich examples that you can find in there. But thank you for talking us through some of the main points. It's my pleasure to now turn to Adriana Hanushik-Becherovic, who is a senior legal advisor at Trial International in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And I'm going to ask Adriana, how do issues related to war present in your legal and advocacy work nearly 30 years after the peace agreement? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Your Excellencies. Good afternoon, everybody. I wish, first of all, to thank the International Peace Institute and Kvinna for organizing this great event and for having me here. I have to admit that it always strikes me when I distance myself and realize that actually 30 years have passed since the end of the war. Because a prevailing subjective perception of myself, my fellow citizens, and especially of our victims, is that it feels like it ended yesterday. Actually, it is still omnipresent in the hearts and the minds of our victims and of the broader society of Bosnia. And I believe there is a direct link between this perception and our failure to properly deal with our past and to try to reach a sense of closure in this way. I happen to have lived through the war as a child. And I strongly remember how suddenly my birthday wishes when putting out birthday candles changed from wishing dolls to wholeheartedly wishing for the wars to stop. And eventually it did stop after 3.5 years. And of course, we were all thrilled about it. But this was not equal to creating true peace. The absence of the war is just the beginning of a path towards peace, a path which shall be focusing on establishing the truth, enabling the access to justice, to reparations, to a sense of recognition. This is what our organization, along with many others, are working on tirelessly. Trial International is fighting against impunity and supporting victims of war crimes with a focus on conflict-related sexual violence victims in their quest to access justice and reparations. There have been and still are many challenges to introduce changes of laws, changes of policies, and changes of mindsets in a patriarchal society plagued by the war. The Dayton Peace Agreement from 1995 brought an end to the war, but at the same time, it did not provide for a proper platform to properly deal with the past. It established a complex ethnopolitical system and dysfunctional decision-making system, which makes decision-making especially tough when it comes to war crimes-related topics. And these political obstructions, which resulted from such a system having been established, led in the end to insufficient progress with regard to establishing the truth and the recognition of the rights of war crimes victims. For instance, Bosnia has not yet provided compensation to its victims of war crimes. Out of the estimated 20,000 CRSV victims, only 1,000 have received some form of financial assistance through the social welfare system. But this is not compensation in its true sense. Many of them, of the victims of war crimes who have claimed compensation in civil proceedings, have been rejected in application of statutes of limitations. On top of that, they have been bound to pay court costs in application of the rule that the loser pays the costs to the very entity that they had sued for repairing the harm caused to them. This situation has led to a re-traumatization of victims, it goes without saying. These past 3 decades, women's rights organizations have continuously advocating for victims to receive equal treatment as civilian victims of war throughout the country. But this is yet not established because of political reasons. And victims do have different conditions for accessing rights, different scopes of rights, depending on their place of residence. But let me continue with some more positive examples and on demonstrating how civil society organizations may have a role in combating gender-based violence in conflict-affected contexts. Children born of wartime rape have been stigmatized, left without support in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and were actually left invisible for the last 3 decades. And in 2022, those children have, with our assistance and the assistance of the international community in Bosnia and Herzegovina, been recognized as civilian victims of war in one part of the country. This was a precedent on the European soil, and it was one of the few examples of such legal recognition on the global level. And it took us thus 3 decades for these children to receive recognition. But when speaking to them, you could see that it meant the world to them. And this is a reason why we must not give up our fights, even after such a long time period has passed. I wish to use this opportunity to emphasize that the arguments we have been using in our advocacy process were relying a lot on the arguments put forward by the different UN actors in recent years on the need to recognize the rights of those children. And this is something which we have been using also with regard to aligning the domestic realities, laws, policies, case law with international human rights standards in different areas. And I can talk about it later on during the discussion. Nowadays, there are many tools out there which you may be using, many recommendations, many findings. But when we started to work on this 15 years ago, this was not the case. So what we would be doing is regularly submitting shadow reports to UN special procedures and human rights treaty bodies. Or we would conduct strategic human rights litigation before the UN Committee Against Torture or the CEDAW Committee, which resulted in first CRSV cases having been litigated in front of those bodies. Once we would have the recommendations and findings, we would go back to domestic authorities, raising awareness about their existence, about those standards to be achieved, and pushing for their implementation. Another important victory of civil society organizations I would like to single out is the fact that under big advocacy and pressure from our side in 2014, the Prosecutor's Office of Bosnia and Herzegovina finally announced that they are willing to prioritize the prosecution of CRSV crimes. Before that, they were regarded somehow as lesser crimes. On top of that, in 2015, trial triggered the first historic award of compensation to a victim of CRSV in criminal proceedings. And it became since then common practice in Bosnia and Herzegovina. We have tackled stigmatization in courtrooms through policy research and capacity building and awareness raising. And we have also introduced a legal obligation for the Ministry of Justice to represent gender-based violence victims in criminal proceedings. And this positive practice started to spill over also to other peacetime gender-based violence crimes being prosecuted in criminal proceedings, a fact that we are very happy about. And this led slowly all together to strengthening a survivor-centered approach in criminal proceedings amongst by various involved actors in those proceedings. Women's organizations supporting survivors and being in direct contact with them have this unique position of being able to see proceedings through the eyes of survivors, including what happens behind the scenes. We are able to get informed by survivors or to notice ourselves some systemic issues which may be missed from the radar of somebody officially monitoring courtrooms proceedings and the implementation of various laws. And those observations are then directly informing our advocacy goals and shaping our next activities. If women's rights organizations are closely collaborating with survivors, and if they are actively listening to their wishes and their needs, they are able to identify those gaps and needs which have to be addressed, and then to channel the messages of survivors to stakeholders. And international actors, international organizations and member states, and their allies have a chance to play an important role in supporting those processes so that we strive in synergy with each other to reach truth, to reach justice and reparations as crucial factors which are needed to enable true closure and sustainable positive peace in conflict-affected contexts. I wish to use this opportunity to express my gratitude towards Kvinna till Kvinna, an organization continuously supporting not only us, but other organizations in Bosnia and Herzegovina and other organizations in 20 countries around the world. I'm going to stop here, being time conscious, and I'm looking forward to continuing this discussion later on.
Thank you, Adriana, and thank you for laying out that important legal work that you are doing at Trial International, even so many years after the peace agreement. We'll now switch to a different context. We're going to hear from Oksana Potapova, who's a researcher and women's rights activist from Ukraine. Oksana, I'd like to ask you, what role do you think the Ukrainian women's rights movement can and should have in the reconstruction process of Ukraine? Thank you, Oksana.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very moved to be here, realizing that I am speaking today on behalf of a lot of people who have informed both the report that we are presenting today, but also who are colleagues and friends and feminist sisters. So acknowledging their work first and foremost, and also gratitude to Kvinna till Kvinna for being a longstanding partner of the women's movement in Ukraine as well. You may be wondering why I will be talking about recovery and reconstruction at an event that is titled Gender-Based Violence in Conflict Contexts and how that is connected. And I will try to share with you a little bit of the reason why. But before that, I want to sort of start with my own reflections of being this morning at the Security Council debate and, coming back to the UN for the second time and asking myself why we continuously having all these agendas, why we continuously have these events, while at the same time observing the violence that is happening, both armed violence and gender violence. And what feminist analysis and feminist research and activism has helped me understand is that women's activists and feminist researchers make a crucial connection between different forms of violence and how they lead to wars and how they continue after wars. This is something that is called in feminist literature the continuum of violence, which allows women's rights organizations both to identify early signs of potential increase of authoritarianism, of potential increase of militarization, of polarization of gender norms, and hierarchical and patriarchal gender orders within states that then may lead to very specific foreign policy decisions, such as waging wars on their neighbors. This is the case of the war in Ukraine, and as probably those who are in the middle of it, in the center of it, we know the interconnections between a democratic society that upholds gender equality and protects women from gender-based violence and the potential for peace. And the reason I'm talking about continuum of violence and the continuum of work is that I want to remind you that the armed violence in Ukraine is also going on for more than 2.5 years. It's actually started in 2014, and women's rights organizations all across the country, but especially in the east of Ukraine, have started to respond then and there already, realizing and identifying vulnerabilities that women experience in both accessing services and accessing justice, but also living in frontline territories close to the armed violence, and also doing research on the interconnections of conservative movements funded by authoritarian states like our big neighbor, and anti-gender movements within countries. And I'm starting with this because I think, and I will actually look back in at the end, because I think this should become a central conversation at the Security Council on the international level. We can no longer put gender as a side discussion. It already has become one of the key indicators of potential violence and also one of the preconditions for peace. And the second one, which I'm here also to speak about, is of course the role of civil society, women's civil society, that doesn't start when the violence starts, and it also doesn't end when the armed violence ends. And the reason why Ukrainian women's rights organizations have been so powerful in their response, both on the ground in terms of humanitarian response, services, and advocacy, is because they have been working and they have been supported through funding and partnerships, and they have been able to build their capacity and their strength. So some of the very unexpected for us, but very gains that we celebrate that have happened already since the invasion include, for example, the ratification of the Istanbul Convention, which the civil society has advocated for over a decade, and finally saw that coming into place after the invasion, and is now keen to monitor the implementation and the proper financing of the Istanbul Convention, which we are really hoping for and expecting will lay ground for a comprehensive system of both prevention and services, and work with the survivors of different forms of gender-based and domestic violence. As my colleague Jessica outlined, the report also shows that despite an obvious focus on the sexual violence, conflict-related sexual violence related to the invasion, which our government has been able to respond to quite swiftly, both in terms of legislation, systems, and accountability mechanisms that are being put in place. We cannot disqualify other forms of violence and other forms of vulnerability that are compounded as a result of ongoing war, militarization, poverty, and millions of people being made vulnerable through displacement, through wounding, or losses of family members, or return of soldiers from the front line. And I think the conversation about recovery and connection to gender-based violence is a conversation about an enabling environment where both a survivor-centered approach can thrive and can be implemented, but also an environment where violence doesn't happen or is prevented or is minimized. And that environment includes, first and foremost, a strong civil society that is not reduced to the role of service deliveries, which is often the case that we see in Ukraine and in other contexts where strong, capable, and talented civil society organizations start receiving funding and become the only service providers in their country. And they continue to be that way for years. And they have no capacity to be advocates, to be analysts, and to be watchdogs for the systemic change that is required. It is crucial to continue to support civil society at this moment, both in terms of their work with survivors and humanitarian work, as well as their advocacy and analysis that they continue to do, including products like this report and other advocacy. In terms of the conversations around recovery and reconstruction of Ukraine, which have also started already as the war continues, and at the same time as Ukraine is, the government of Ukraine and society is thinking about the future that the society is fighting for, we have unfortunately seen lack of spaces for participation of women's rights organizations, women's groups, and in general, lack of feminist analysis in these conversations, both due to governmental restrictions, but also I think, again, due to lack of an understanding of the crucial interconnection between these two agendas. And I think going forward, it is our request and our demand, in fact, on all of the partners and international partners to ensure that these spaces exist, that women's organizations and voices are part of these conversations. And again, not only as a standalone event, excuse me, I'm getting emotional. Because I'm talking about the country where I want to live and I want to go back to, and know that that women are not made solely responsible for taking care and of their family members and of their elderly, as is the situation right now in many cases. And the issue of violence prevention and the issue of recovery is also an issue of employment. It's an issue of women's economic empowerment and a thorough feminist political economic analysis, which I think is still lacking in many spaces where we talk about both peace and gender equality. That's why for me, it's actually very thrilling that we are having this conversation at an institution that has the name Peace in it. And I'm hoping that this analysis will be more intertwined, both in terms of what solutions need to be there and in terms of who is actually at the table and why. And as my colleagues mentioned, for example, the appearance of the term sextortion and the type of violence that is qualified under sextortion. If you think about the examples that back up this kind of term, they are deeply rooted in inequalities, in poverty, and in lack of access to resources that women unfortunately are not able to access in any other way but through their bodies and through the sexuality that is then made is objectified. So I wanted to encourage you to think about gender-based violence and conflict-related sexual violence as an issue that is deeply interconnected with sustainable peace, with the kind of future that we are envisioning in Ukraine and I think globally in terms of the kind of peace we want. And the voice and the role of women and women's rights organizations is inseparable in shaping that future, both at the national level in Ukraine, and I would repeat, as I promised, to link it back at the Security Council here in New York, where I think we must start talking about gender equality as a precondition for global peace and democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Oksana, for applying that sharp feminist analysis throughout your remarks and really talking us through that continuum of violence and contextualizing the dynamics in Ukraine. I'm now going to turn to a virtual panelist who is unable to be here in person, but glad we could have her online. Solange Lashiga, who is from the South Kivu Congolese Women's Caucus for Peace. Solange, I'd like to ask you, what are some of the lessons learned in the context of the DRC regarding raising awareness and monitoring of gender-based violence amid high levels of stigma and pushback? Solange, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for Kvinna and IPI for organizing this event. Hello to everybody in the room. In DRC, when we speak about a lesson we have learned, I would like to mention that the main lesson, I think, which may be even the mother of all lessons, is that if you keep quiet or only watch, no change. It means that to have change, one has to voice up. One has to be courageous. One has to be committed, make context analysis, setting up strategies, networking, of course, understanding the problem. For the case of DRC, women organizations have tried to break silence. And by breaking silence, they got a window to warn the community and the governance institution about the existence of gender-based violence and the consequences on the whole community, and mainly on women and girls. When we try to look at the situation of DRC concerning patriarchy, when women's rights organization tried to raise the voice, it was not easy, because in our society in DRC, the education in the families show that boys are more important than girls, and girls are taught to be silent, not dare claim or report any bad situation they encounter in their families or in the society, for them, the reason that if they try to report, it will be the shame and the stigma toward the family. And we as activists, the question is to know what kind of protection a woman or a girl should bring to the family while she's slowly dying. And that's why, thanks to awareness, we voiced up. By voicing up in the community, ladies and women understood that they have to fight against the harmful socio-cultural norms in order to fight for their rights. And that's why when you try to go in different communities, in the rural area especially, you are going to find women and girls who have stood up, who address the issues regarding fighting GBV in their communities, in their families. They raise questions about, for example, eco-schooling, eco-inheritance, the question of fighting domestic violence, the question of promoting women's access to justice, and that of women participation at decision-making level. Of course, DRC, as some other countries in Africa which are in armed conflict period, in DRC, the question or the context of gender-based violence became heavier because of the armed conflict situation. And we began experiencing different other forms of gender-based violence. Imagine a context where after raping a woman, they shoot in the vagina, or they take sand, they put in the vagina. Can you imagine that situation? It's horrible. But Congolese women stood up and say, we cannot keep it quiet. Because at the same time, we denounce, as it's a patriarchal system, of course, many men find in us people who are strange. But by voicing up, we happen to mobilize, to work in synergy so that the stakeholders in different communities, so that the authorities can understand that sexual violence, gender-based violence is a reality in Democratic Republic of Congo, and that they have to fight all forms of violence. And we found that by networking, what did we do? We mobilized women all over the Democratic Republic of Congo by documenting, by raising awareness, by monitoring. And by doing that, we got proof and sufficient data, which gave us opportunities to advocate for the revision of some laws. For example, it's the case of what we call the family code. In the former family code, a woman to work, she has to go to get the permission of the husband. But the revision of the family code, that article has been taken, removed in the code, the family code. We have also mobilized all over the country to suggest or to propose new legislative initiatives. In the case of a network for advocacy in which Caucus des Femmes is, we presented a law fighting domestic violence in DRC. Unfortunately, our parliamentarians removed from the law some important gender issues, such as the gender-based violence regarding economy in the house or in the family, the question of gender-based violence between intimate partners, those who have been removed in the law. But for us, even if they have removed that, we think that by voting the law and keeping other aspects, it's an opportunity for us to see that they have recognized the existence of gender-based violence and that everybody have to fight against them. And such laws for us, it's an opportunity to see in the coming days, in the next legislative period, what can we do so that we can reinforce the law. The experience of DRC women's activists, we have set up what we call inclusive community mobilization approaches, such as peace clubs or community dialogue groups for women's rights, gender equality, and social cohesion. Such a group are groups which have got legitimacy, and people refer to them when they face a problem in the family as far as gender-based violence is concerned, or if there are some conflict which occur in family, those community dialogue groups are referred to try to see how they can settle the problem. Of course, in a participatory or a participative way. And of course, by engaging with the community, those groups of dialogue have given us opportunity to strengthen positive masculinity because they are made of men, women, young, even religious leaders, local leaders, those who are in charge of what we call norms in our country. So they are in those groups. And by having people like that, they serve as an example to show all the rest of the community members that no one is accepted to go on committing or living gender-based violence committed on women. What we have also noticed that when we work with victims and we bring them some economical support in their communities, this is one of the sustainable strategies to fight against gender-based violence and stigma. There are a lot of lessons we have learned, but from that summary, we think that Congolese women, through their different organizations, they are watchdogs, as one of the panelists mentioned, and they need support. They need support because even if there is the war more than 20 years ago, in our communities, there are situations, there are conflicts, there are GBV, which must be fought. And if we are not there, the situation can be worsened. To finish, I would like to say that being a woman rights organization, being an activist, being a journalist in DRC is not easy. Despite stress we got from different people who commit gender-based violence, especially in conflict, we still be committed. We still think that in the coming years, our generation will live a Congo without violence. That's what I would like to ask everybody who is in the room. Congo cannot get peace if all the world doesn't have an eye or doesn't take the conflict in DRC as a priority. Of course, when we speak of UN, we see what they are doing. It's good to condemn what is happening in DRC, but at this time I'm speaking, women, girls, they don't have anywhere to sleep, and they don't know if tomorrow morning they will wake up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Solange. And thank you so much for telling us about the important work you're doing. I hope you can hear the round of applause you're getting from here. We wish you were here with us.
Yes.
I will now turn to Letitia Anderson, who is the team leader for political advocacy and communications at the United Nations Office of the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence and Conflict. Letitia, how does the Office of the SRSG, SVC, work to address sexual violence as a specific form of gender-based violence in conflict-affected contexts? And how have approaches evolved in recent years? What are the strategic priorities and emerging concerns, and what tools are available to address them?
Thanks, Phoebe and IPI, for bringing us all together on this day of WPS debate. And congratulations to Kvinna on the new report, which we are reading closely in our office. I've actually been with the mandate on sexual violence in conflict since its inception and was part of its conception, which leads people to ask me some interesting questions. Firstly, oh, are you still here? But then after that, as you did, Phoebe, more about the evolution and trajectory of the agenda and whether current realities actually correspond to the founding hopes and visions we had back in 2008 when campaigning for sexual violence to be elevated onto the Security Council agenda. So in that vein, I'll share some honest reflections, partly retrospective, partly prospective, partly introspective, as a way of explaining our core priorities and approaches, including to new and emerging concerns. But really the genesis of this agenda was to bring all political, diplomatic and enforcement tools to bear on an atrocity as old and enduring as war itself, called history's greatest silence, the world's least condemned war crime. And we don't often cast our minds back to the wars of antiquity, but I do think it's worth recalling that for centuries, rape was well within the norms and customs of acceptable warfare, the very goal of which was to conquer territory, resources and women as wives, concubines, trophies, and slave labor for demographic and reproductive advantage. And this is from the Trojan War to the Sabine women to Viking raids. Wars were fought on and over the bodies of women. And the sheer scale and ubiquity of these crimes prevented them from being reported, with mass rape really passing into history as a kind of abstract metaphor for national humiliation, or being erased altogether as an unseemly private matter that was unspeakable, unprintable, and therefore unpunishable. So I raise this gendered political history of wartime rape because I really think it still carries weight and casts a long shadow. And as Susan Brown Miller wrote in her seminal text on the subject, we have to give rape its history in order to deny it a future. It's interesting to recall that the first recorded war crimes trial to include an indictment of rape dates back to 1474. So the issue was only taken up by the Peace and Security Policy Agenda in 2008, just 5.5 centuries later. And I think what really explains that lag is gender bias, is the silencing of the victims who, as a result of sociocultural taboos and conditioning, bear the blame, shame, and stigma, of course, rather than the attacker. So we can't lose sight of all of this because I think it's precisely what has made sexual violence war's ultimate secret weapon and, frankly, the enforcement arm of patriarchy, terrorizing women and girls into restricting their freedom of movement, freedom of dress, expression, agency, and participation, often triggering more repression and paternalism in the name of protection. And every year we report contemporary examples of forced marriage, the withdrawal of girls from education, the withdrawal of women from public life, seclusion and segregation, ostensibly to protect women and girls in conflict-affected and displacement settings. And of course, communities face an impossible choice on the front lines because sexual violence is seen as dishonoring the entire tribe, community, family, rendering the victim unmarriageable, destroying their future prospects for economic and social stability. But at the same time, we can't solve a problem from the same level of consciousness that created it. So we absolutely need larger freedom, larger rights, rather than more repression in a reductive approach to protection. As an international lawyer, when I approached this issue, I was really conscious that the ICC Rome Statute had recognized sexual violence as a self-standing war crime, crime against humanity, an act of genocide. But when I was sitting in the Security Council chamber in 2007, listening to the WPS open debate, what I heard was council members characterizing this as an appalling tragedy, as a kind of byproduct of war, but one that was not within their charter competence as the world's apex peace and security body, better left to the CSW, ECOSOC, or the Human Rights Council, which of course have their roles to play, but frankly don't have equivalent teeth to enforce international law. So the logic of the series of Security Council resolutions since 2008 was to integrate sexual violence concerns systematically into peacekeeping mandate authorizations and renewals, into sanctions regimes, into ICC referrals, into ceasefire and peace negotiations, hybrid courts and tribunals, Security Council field visits and public diplomacy. And this was really back in the heady days when the Security Council did actually refer matters to the ICC, Darfur in 2005, Libya in 2011, when it established transitional justice mechanisms like the Special Court for Sierra Leone in 2000, and even created a compensation commission in the wake of the 1991 Gulf War that included sexual violence as a compensatable harm. So there was a sense of optimism in the early days that we had all of these untapped tools tools that could be turned in the service of a neglected cause. And when you compare with 1994 during the Rwandan genocide, I think it's absolutely striking that there was not one mention of sexual violence during the Security Council deliberations or in the UNAMIR mandate. And we now know an estimated 500,000 women were raped as a tool of genocide. So in the intervening 15 years since the advent of this agenda, I do think we've seen dramatic normative, institutional and operational progress. The normative framework is clear and categorical, and it represents a red line against all forms of sexual violence, even in the midst of war. And this was largely built on the Beijing Platform for Action, the jurisprudence of the ad hoc tribunals, the Rome Statute, and Resolution 1325. But I would note that 1325 required states to avoid amnesty for sexual violence where feasible in paragraph 11, and paragraph 4 of 1820 was a corrective to that, to say amnesty has to be categorically avoided for sexual violence as an international crime, which creates a positive obligation to either extradite or prosecute suspects. Additionally, of course, there's CEDAW, there's General Recommendations 19, 30, 35 on the application to conflict situations and on sexual and gender-based violence, and a whole raft of regional instruments, the Maputo Protocol, the ICGLR Protocol, the Istanbul Protocol, the Inter-American Convention, with all of the regional monitoring mechanisms that go with it. But what I would say is implementation really happens at the national level, or it doesn't happen at all. So one of the tools and strategic priorities we have is to roll out model legislative guidance and provisions for a comprehensive legislative framework at the national level to help states align their laws with international and global standards. And as the report notes, it has to be comprehensive in order not to pit one group of victims or survivors against another. And also the resolutions importantly created an institutional architecture to help operationalize the paradigm shift of 1820. That includes the SRSG, currently SRSG pattern, who provides the UN system with coherent and strategic leadership and has 3 operational arms. One is the UN Action Against Sexual Violence in Conflict Coordination Network, which has supported catalytic joint projects in over 50 countries since 2009. The Team of Experts on the Rule of Law and Sexual Violence in Conflict, which works to strengthen institutional safeguards against impunity at the national level, and women's protection advisors in the field who gather the evidence base for advocacy and action, work directly with belligerent parties to foster compliance with international norms, and advise senior UN leadership. But I would note that out of 20 countries within the remit of our reporting, only 8 have that dedicated frontline WPA capacity. So we have the tools and infrastructure, we have the architecture, but it needs to be strengthened and taken to scale. And this brings me to our third pillar, which is the operational impact. I think today, honestly, the UN is reaching and supporting thousands of survivors who were once invisible and inaccessible. But every year, the number of states within our remit continues to expand and the geographical scope continues to grow. So it's really clear that the funding has not kept pace and nowhere is the level of human and financial resources equal to the scale of the challenge. Obviously, military spending has reached record highs while bilateral aid budgets are slashed and funding appeals for gender-based violence in emergencies remain largely unmet. And ultimately, we get the world we pay for. And I think we're continuing to shortchange the survivors and the civil society organizations that bear the burden largely of delivering on their behalf. So in setting the priorities for the mandate, one thing that our SRSG emphasizes is really being guided by the ground truths and the voices of survivors as our moral compass. Survivors are not just stories or photo exhibits, they are rights holders, stakeholders, and pen holders of history. And that's as it should be today. And I think the main lesson we've learned from this is that sexual violence in conflict is a political issue. It's not just a niche technical issue. We can't program our way out of wartime rape. We have to see this as inseparable from the global level macro trends that we're facing today. I mean, every new wave of warfare brings with it a rising tide of sexual violence, and it places an undue burden on civil society organizations to respond to that reality, when in fact, no amount of protection or assistance is a substitute for peace. And the ultimate aim of our agenda is not a war without rape, it's a world without war. And that's where we need to come back to disarming patriarchy and really demobilizing the mindsets that give rise to sexual violence in conflict. And I would say the reason the vicious cycle of violence, impunity, and vengeance has not been broken is due to the wider context of increased militarization, record numbers of conflicts, the highest number of conflicts since the Second World War, record levels of forced displacement, 110 displaced civilians globally, rising authoritarianism, shrinking civic space, an epidemic of coups and unconstitutional shifts of power, increasing political violence targeting women's human rights defenders and journalists who bring these atrocities to the world, and of course, virulent backlash against gender equality, the net effect of which is to worsen the trend lines on conflict-related sexual violence, to turn the clock further and further back on women's rights, and to leave the survivors further and further behind when it comes to the dividends of development and peace. And at the same time as these entrenched conflicts and trends remain, we're seeing new and emerging threats surface. So we're seeing a surge in sexual harassment and gender-based hate speech in the relatively ungoverned digital space. We're seeing an array of new actors operating on contemporary battlefields, including mercenaries, proxy forces, private military and security companies, which is part of the political economy of conflict. And in that regard, I would note more attention needs to be paid to the political economy of conflict, terrorism and transnational organized crime, in which women and girls are part of the currency used between arms bearers. And we're also seeing increased climate-driven insecurity, with climate-driven displacement and competition over resources resulting in intercommunal violence, including sexual violence. We're increasingly attuned as well to transitional contexts. So as peacekeeping missions draw down in Mali, the DRC and elsewhere, the security umbrella is closing for protection and assistance activities. In terms of our geographical priorities, I would just say that the challenge is that one crisis eclipses the next, and we can't allow survivors of conflict-related sexual violence to become forgotten victims of forgotten conflicts. I think among the most meaningful actions of our office is a compilation of the annual reports of the Secretary General on conflict-related sexual violence, which not only raise and praise progress, but importantly name and shame perpetrators. And the latest report names 49 state and non-state parties implicated in patterns of conflict-related sexual violence. 75% of them are persistent perpetrators or repeat offenders, meaning they've taken no remedial or corrective actions, and their listing needs to be better aligned with sanctions practice and the work of accountability mechanisms. Every year, we report some 3,000 UN verified violations, and then just 3 to 4 emblematic prosecutions. So the justice deficit is also continuing to grow. And of course, this is an underreported crime. So humanitarians in the field estimate that for every case that reaches a clinic, 10 to 20 go unreported and unaddressed. So the data we're able to reduce is just the extreme tip of the iceberg, which also means the redress is just a drop in the ocean. Most cases never reach a clinic, let alone a courtroom. So in sum, I would say that while we have a new level of consciousness and a new consensus on this issue, and there has been a very important shift in paradigm and perspective. We don't have this cognitive dissonance anymore about how can an act of rape be an act of war. What we still need to shift is to take to scale the resource base and the operations on the ground. We have the normative frameworks, we have the institutional architecture, but we really still lack humanitarian access, reach, and resources for impact at a country level. And I think, we've understood now that conflict-related sexual violence threatens both individual human rights and international security, that it violates the will of the victims, but also the will of the world's paramount peace and security body. So it's really a credibility test for the Security Council and the whole multilateral system to replace this might makes right logic of war with a rules-based international order in which no military or political leader is above the law and no woman or girl is beneath the scope of its protection. What really strikes me is not just that so many of the perpetrators remain unpunished, but that so many of them remain still in power. And we've been saying for so many years that wartime rape should lead to the cells of the prison rather than the corridors of power. And I would just say at the end that sometimes we hear this sort of idea, which I think is a misnomer, that the role of our mandate should be to work itself out of a job. I think eternal vigilance is the price of progress, and the risk of sexual violence recurs with every new conflict, every new generation. So we really need to think about the long sweep of history in which sexual violence has gone from being an acceptable part of warfare, which was itself an acceptable form of statecraft, to being somewhat sidelined and an afterthought, to being central in peace and security discourse. And the next step is to make it unthinkable, to demobilize the mindsets that give rise to this time and time again, to disarm patriarchy. And there, I think we absolutely have to draw inspiration from the women's movement, which has been an irrepressible engine for social progress, and I would say the most transformative force on the planet. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of our speakers. And we are now going to turn to the floor. There are floating microphones. I'm just requesting that you keep your comments or questions brief and concise. We'll then turn back to each of the panelists to have 1 to 2 minutes to address any questions and wrap up. So we'd like to hear from the floor. Please just raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. I'm happy to read. We have some from online audiences, so maybe we'll start there. So Aaron Lyons says, while the speakers have discussed the local efforts of women's rights organizations and NGOs to support survivors of GBV, often there are few opportunities for national criminal prosecution in the post-conflict environment. Could you discuss how women's rights organizations and NGOs can do a better job in combating and ending impunity for GBV crimes? For example, how can women's rights organizations and NGOs better utilize universal jurisdiction to ensure an accountability that reaches beyond national boundaries? Another attendee says, how are women leading international peace processes and response to conflict? How does the international community support governments rendered powerless by aggressive violence to assert the rights of women? Any questions from the floor before we turn back to the panel? Yes, in the front.
Thank you so much. My name is Anastasia Olembo. I am with Women for Women International. We work actually in DRC as a women international organization, but supporting the country office. We are in Iraq. We are in many other countries. My question is to Ms. Anderson, where she talked about naming and shaming of perpetrators of sexual violence. Is there something that can be done beyond that? Because we are saying you can name, but the person is still in power. You can shame, but the person is still in power. What is it that the international community can do? Because I think all the instruments are there to render the perpetrators out of office, to stop impunity. Because listening to our online presenter, I think there's a statement she made where she said, imagine you are raped and a gun is used on your vagina. When you think about that, it's very painful. And we are naming, we are shaming, but you're not getting this, we are not uprooting the people from power. I think we have the power. I think we have instruments. We have willing people to be able to implement what is in the papers. So for me, it's what else can be done so that impunity is actually erased and that we can begin to see the voices of the women, the voices of the children, the girls who are still also being affected. And what does that mean for us in terms of having women tomorrow? Because the adolescent girls are highly affected by the same war. Ukraine, who was reporting from Ukraine, she's mentioned the same thing. The movement in between, as you're walking, you're carrying your children with you, but they're also not secure from the sexual violence that is happening. So I think we have, the solutions are there, and I think it can be done. The second question is about actualizing, having justice for the women. It is one thing for the women to be able to report the instances, but to continue with the process of the legal framework to have the redress becomes very strenuous. So what is it that can be done so that the women, the process of seeking justice is reduced? Because sometimes it's very tedious and the when it comes to the law, there are many cases. Is there a way that the cases of sexual violence can have a special court, special magistrate, special redress, so that that period is reduced and the women and girls can get their justices? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your question. Now everyone's ready. Okay, I see maybe one hand in the back. Just a reminder to please keep your questions brief so the panelists have time to answer them.
Okay, thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Anna Dazita Samuel from South Sudan, working for a women's rights organization. I just have one question, basically, that one directly going to the UN representative. From your conversation, I mean, from your speech, you talked about, of course, the funding that the UN has at least gone to the women's rights organization. But my question is, has that money gone to the local women's rights organization who are the frontliners? Because there is allocating money, but sometimes the money even will end up within the system. And knowing that the women's rights organization at the ground are the frontliners, their life are at risk, dealing with the survivors with no money. And sometimes when that money goes, it's a peanut that you have to save lives. You have to save women and girls who are exposed to risk, who are at the verge of losing their life. So what I just want to know is, if that money is really going to the right cause, and if yes, or if not, is there a mechanism that can really be used to follow that, to ensure that that money has reached to the survivors or to the people who are supposed to implement? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to turn back to our panel. They have a hefty task. You've been posed several questions. We'll give you each 1 to 2 minutes to address any questions and conclude. And we're going to go in reverse order. And Letitia, many of the questions were for you. So I'll turn the floor to you.
Thoughtful questions and contributions. Just on the naming and shaming, what I would say on this is, in practice, this has really served as a form of leverage to trigger parties to engage with the mandate. Because the point of the law is not just justice after the fact. It's really about prevention and deterrence through compliance with the norms that exist. We have had parties approach the office saying, what more can we do to get off the list of shame? And one fascinating case study, the only delisting we've done to date, is Côte d'Ivoire, where the armed forces took all of the requisite measures in order to be removed from the list. So it has been an effective prompt, but then I think it needs to be better known. Often I'll go to DRC or Guinea or somewhere else and people will not know about the report or the list. And for civil society, that's an advocacy tool in their hands as well. So it needs to be better, I think, known. And then the point of sanctions and aligning the list of perpetrators for sexual violence with the list of entities sanctioned, and sexual violence is part of the criteria in 9 of the 15 UN sanctions regimes, is to remove the means of doing harm so that they no longer have arms, resources, freedom of travel and access. And that effectively raises the scope of costs and consequences for sexual violence. That makes it a liability for these groups rather than a tool of achieving political, military, and economic ends. So it is effective on many levels, but it's still, like all of these tools, needs to be optimally used. And then I would say to the other speaker, nothing happens without frontline women CSOs. That is what you see time and time again on the ground. It's almost like a parallel universe that we have a lot of rhetoric here. And then, you know, I remember going to the POC sites in Juba and the women had nothing. And the way we personally work as a mandate is we work through the Women's Protection Advisors, who's in touch with the civil society organizations on the ground. We work through the UN action entities that work with civil society partners. But of course, we need to continually bridge the treetops and the grassroots, right? So that the realm of high politics is not happening without being guided by local realities and local solutions.
Thank you. Solange, we'll turn to you for a 1-minute conclusion. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would like to conclude to say that for the case of DRC, as there is two contexts, armed conflict context, sociocultural norm context, and if there were no women's rights organization, the situation could be worse than what we are living today. Waiting for high advocacy, the solution which will come probably with the help of those big countries, we women, we still need support from international partners, support from other women activists who face the same situation as us, because I think, and I'm sure that having change experience give one another more strategies to face the situation of gender-based violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Solange. Oksana.
Some nice soundtrack to my introduction. I will try to respond collectively to several questions and bringing back to the thinking that I had at the beginning of my activism when I was asked why I'm doing both peace work and women's rights work. And to me, those two areas remain inherently interconnected because both of them are aimed at preventing, reducing, and addressing different forms of violence. But they also, to me, are deeply rooted in critical power analysis. And speaking to questions on impunity, on redress, justice, and also the role of feminist women's rights activists in preventing conflicts, I think we must be looking more critically at the power imbalances that both drive and perpetuate global wars and also gendered violence and the political economy of that violence, as Letitia has also mentioned, both in terms of the arms trade, but also in terms of opportunities to continue to accumulate power and resources for leaders of countries and groups that continue to perpetrate violence. Ukrainian human rights activists and women's rights activists are advocating very actively for the freezing of assets of Russian government and Russian leaders in order for those assets actually to be used as compensation mechanisms for survivors of sexual violence and other types of war crimes, instead of this burden being falling on the government of Ukraine, which economy is already depleted. The perpetrators should be the ones paying. And this is a question that's perhaps outside of the mandate of the UN, but it is a question to global economic structure and to global economic power. And I think this is where feminist activists can speak a lot to. And another thing I want to mention and maybe finish with is that, again, in terms of the unbalanced consequences of speaking out and calling out, we must remember that the burden on those who actually come out and speak, both as survivors and as human rights defenders, are extremely higher than on the supposedly often vulnerable, but still in power and still, in place, the leaders and most times men, but not only perpetrators of violence. So I'm very happy to know that the question of reprisals is now more high on the agenda of a lot of international organizations and also the UN in terms of taking seriously the cost of actually putting that justice in place, the cost on those who are disproportionately affected, first and foremost, women frontline human rights defenders. Thank you.
Thank you for the interesting questions. I will focus on the first one because that's the core of our mandate, the local efforts of organizations fighting against impunity. I would say that there are two directions towards fighting against impunity on the local level. And this is fighting against impunity in individual cases and also influencing policies from a strategic point of view. So when it comes to individual cases, I think the receipt for it would be putting pressure on domestic authorities to prosecute those crimes. And that's what we have been doing in the past with success. And we have been doing this by assisting victims through drafting letters and sending numerous letters in cases, requesting information about the status of the investigations. And there have been also difficult cases where we did not have a response. And in such cases, we would bring this case to, through strategic human rights litigation, to the attention of the Ombudsman or the Constitutional Court of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And in one case, we reached the level of a positive CEDAW decision finding the human rights violation of a victim whose case has not been appropriately prosecuted and punished. And even in 2 instances when we got negative decisions by the Constitutional Court of Bosnia and Herzegovina, in the end, they led, the fact that we conducted this litigation before the Constitutional Court led to the sentencing of perpetrators, because it became, the pressure on the prosecutors to act became that increased. We have been also using universal jurisdiction as a tool. And in one example, just when we were very close to raising an indictment in Switzerland against the perpetrator, he decided to go back to Bosnia because he thought he would be better off to have those crimes prosecuted in Bosnia instead of Switzerland. And it resulted in a sentence which we were not very happy with, but it resulted also with him paying 25,000 euros to the victim. And that's the most important thing, because she was happy about it. And then when it comes to influencing policies, I already told that we have triggered a public statement in 2014 that the prosecutor's office has decided to prioritize the prosecution of CRSV crimes. And this is also a direct result of local efforts. We have been submitting shadow reports to the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, CEDAW, the EU delegation, and we got back many recommendations asking the Bosnian government to prioritize this prosecution. So after that, we would organize awareness raising events with media outreach. We would send out letters to them. We would mention those recommendations in every single letter, in every single case we would be working on. And in the end, under such pressure, they really decided to change their policy, which is great. One other issue we had to deal with is the fact if a prosecutor, acting prosecutor, has the obligation to provide information to a CRSV survivor about the status of criminal investigations. And that's the part where UN recommendations, and as I mentioned before, step in and help us by arguing that actually there is this obligation. There are those human rights standards out there which have to be followed by prosecutors. I remember one case in where it was like ping pong, playing ping pong, sending out letters, arguing with the prosecutor if he should respond to the request for information or not. And in the end, I convinced him. And later on, he was working on other cases where he readily shared the information with us. And it was based on the human rights standards and relevant recommendations by UN bodies. So that those would be, in short, some of the recommendations, some of the lessons learned I would like to share with the person who posed this online question. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you for all those questions. I think I would like to say that, when it comes to how can the process of seeking justice be made easier, of course, it's so important that we learn from different conflict-affected contexts and that we are learning from, for example, Bosnia and Herzegovina, how survivors have experienced the process of seeking justice and trying to ensure that we're improving their experiences. But it's not just about figuring things out and learning things. It's also about this whole change of attitude and the stigma that we're talking about. I want to show a picture from the report. This is a picture from a mobile court in DRC. The survivors are having to hide their faces. They're the ones who are at risk and they're the ones who are shamed. And this tells us everything. And it comes back to what Letitia mentioned. It's not about technical issues. We're not looking for the technical answers. This is a political issue. By the time all the countries in the world have the political will to make this violence end, it will end. And that's it.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you for being here. And thank you especially to our outstanding panel. Thank you so much.